Okay, so if you haven't already seen the movie, go watch that. This will be the informal breakdown where I justify where I put certain events and why. And remember, this is just how I perceive them to occur. Some events are connected, some overlap, and others exist on their own. The timeline is very fluid. It can be rearranged in several different ways. The one we used in the movie isn't even the one we started with. It was after several reevaluations that we finally settled on that one. There were three main factors in determining the timeline. The first was the Ancestor's powers. He starts out as a novice in the arcane forces, compared to at the end, when he's able to curse and hex a whole crew. The second is how much wealth he had. It's implied that he and his family were extremely wealthy, and over time he would spend all that money on his schemes. He would need to acquire more before spending it all again. By the end, he was flat broke. And finally, his own words. While we don't know how much truth is in those words, we'll be able to accept certain things. If he says something was in his early pursuits, or that it was well underway, we can accept that. The family name is unknown, along with his own, but I like to think of him as our crazy Uncle Wayne.
Our family name, once so well regarded, is now barely whispered aloud by decent folk.
Oh yeah, you might hear those throughout this video. The Crimson Court events were the first to occur. The nobles would travel to his estate and engage in all manner of indecency. He sees the Countess and can tell that she's a predator, looking to seduce and kill a man. Half mad, he gave into his own sadistic desires and decided to turn the tables on her. The moonlight reveals her true form, he manages to defeat her and drain her blood. Renara put it best. Why he chose to do this is unknown. I speculate that he did that to humiliate the court, by labeling them all as the parasites they were, since he refers to them as sycophants.
They would arrive in teeming hordes, adorned in powdered wigs and pretension, seeking to slake their thirst on wine and indecency.
Or maybe he hoped the blood would poison them, and wanted to rid himself of their presence. While he was raising a glass in the cinematic, that was just to keep suspicion off of him. He never actually planned to drink it. Give him the old winter came for House Frey special. It was only by accident that the drop landed in his mouth and gave him the vision. Or maybe he just wanted to engage in some lighthearted cannibalism, further depravity. Or maybe, just maybe, the heart was influencing the events, even all the way back then. To be honest, pick a reason. They all work. In one way or another, the vision still occurs, and he sees the heart. So he left, locked the doors behind him, and set to work on the excavation. The excavation was kept secret, even back in the early days. Planning was discreet. Importing tools enabled bodies to handle the manual labor was kept quiet. He still needed to find ways to occupy himself. The dig was going to take quite some time. He would spend his days wandering the Hamlet, becoming something of a local celebrity. He would often be found at the tavern, raising a glass, and that was when he caught the eye of a certain waif, who would shadow him wherever he went. Initially charming, then troublesome, since his newfound interest in the occult would be upsetting to the locals. He had his artifacts imported along the old road until it drew too much attention, so he hired the mariners to sail around the world retrieving what he desired. He also paid them for their secrecy, so they wouldn't tell anyone what he was doing. He took it one step further and had a system of pulleys built along the side of the manor, so they didn't even need to dock in the hamlet. work on the excavation was beginning, and the Ancestor delved into the arcane forces. Here's how I think it played out. Personally, I believe that the blood sacrifices and summonings were his first interest, and that necromancy came later and became his primary pursuit. When he was attempting to summon creatures from the void, he tested various meats. Eventually, he found pig flesh worked best, because of how similar to humans. But in between that discovery, we can assume he tested various animals: fish, dogs, cats, and rats. While the others ended in failure, the rat, at the last moment, twitched back to life for only a second, which is what sparked his interest in necromancy.
Who could have divined the prophetic import of something as unremarkable as a twitch in the leg of a dead rat?
The mariners returned with various books on alchemy and herbology. The Ancestor's next request were for trinkets and tomes on necromancy. And while he was settling in for a long reading session, he received a visitor at the manor. The young woman, known to us as the Hag. She impressed the Ancestor with her knowledge on alchemy and her beauty. So the two began experimenting together. This was the first field the Ancestor gained an expertise in, as he had a tutor to help guide him. Incorporating what he had learned from the Hag into his summoning and blood sacrifices, he performed one final attempt, successfully summoning something from the outer sphere, which he found to be nothing more than a brutish, stupid monster. That was his final attempt at summoning.
I could not store such a prodigious amount of offal, nor could I rid myself of it easily, possessed as it was by unnameable things from outer spheres. When excavations beneath the manor broke through into an ancient network of aqueducts and tunnels, I knew I had found a solution to the problem of disposal.
So he loaded the failed experiments and his most recent failure onto carts and dumped them into the warrens. The failed experiments began forming into the flesh, and the thing he summoned from the void was the swine prince, and it would need to be fed large quantities of meat to sustain itself. It's implied that the Ancestor would lure someone from the town to sacrifice as a meal to the beast, which is how we know these events took place early on, since the town had yet to be culled by the brigands.
Excavations beneath the manor were well underway when a particularly ragged indigent arrived in the hamlet.
The prophet showed up to the hamlet and began ranting about all the crimes the Ancestor had committed, and told the commoners that if he was not stopped, he'd bring about the end of the world. The Ancestor bribed the local constabulary to have this prophet murdered, but the prophet would not die. He kept coming back throughout the years to continue to denounce the Ancestor. So all the way up to him opening the door, the Ancestor would keep trying to kill the prophet.
How had he survived the stockades, the icy waters, and the knives I delivered so enthusiastically into his back?
Maybe it was all the rumors and gossip about the Ancestor's heretical practices finally reaching outside of the hamlet, or, in a crazier option, breaking into the warrens had alerted someone or something to his progress. They knew what he was digging for. The prophet could be part of that ancient civilization that constructed the warrens, acting as a guardian, trying to keep people away from the heart. Meanwhile, the Hag continued her experiments, including self-experimenting. consuming strange fungi, herbs, and other mixtures, trying to gain insight into the heart. But her self-experimenting changed her, physically and mentally. And that was when the Ancestor banished her to the Wealds. Why he banished her instead of killing her could be for two reasons. Maybe he still had a soft spot in his heart for her, or the situation would not have ended favorably. He cut it close with the Countess and didn't want to push his luck again, so the only option was to let her go. Losing the Hag was unfortunate, but it showed him that other experts existed in the world that he could learn from. I assume the mariners would have played a role in this part too. Sailing the world, they brought back experts in necromancy that the Ancestor could learn from, at an increased cost, of course. Once they arrived, he was able to impress them by showing them the various techniques and recipes he had learned from the Hag, which is how we know these events take place after the Hag taught the Ancestor.
Eager to plumb the depths of their knowledge and share with them certain techniques and alchemical processes I had found to yield wondrous and terrifying results. Having learned all I could from my visiting guests, I murdered them as they slept.
Why could have been for two reasons. The cost of these lessons would be better spent on the excavation, and two, he couldn't have any loose ends. The Hag was able to leave because she caught him off guard. He knew better this time, though. He was learning. He knew he needed to do things differently now. By now, some time had passed. The Ancestor had various levels of mastery over the powers of the arcane arts, but he was still learning. He was still bribing the constabulary in the Hamlet to turn a blind eye to his activities, along with the mariners. And the excavation was past the Warrens. We could consider this our time skip. He's past his early days. The farmlands around the estate were suffering from a blight, which I believe to have been caused by the Hag, since blight is typically related to fungi. The crop failures made the miller desperate. He had heard of the rumors, the dark powers the Ancestor possessed, and hoped that those powers could save his fields. He approached the Ancestor, and he agreed to help, in exchange for the miller's land. The miller agreed, and the Ancestor spent the last bit of coin he possessed, having stone slabs imported, carved, and erected around the farmstead. This was the turning point of his financial struggles. He sought out the pelagic creatures in the cove, looking to make a deal to refill his coffers. They demanded a sacrifice and an obscure artifact, delivered under the blood moon. The latter was easy enough, as the mariners had been bringing him artifacts for years. The sacrifice would take more legwork, but the waif, who had been shadowing him throughout his time in the Hamlet, followed him to the meeting. She ran off, but the idea was already planted. The night of the sacrifice arrived, and he managed to lure her to the edge of the waters. How he did that is up to interpretation. Maybe he left her a letter, telling her to meet him by the cove, or maybe he just wandered down to the cove and waited for her to show up. However it happened, he chained her to the idol and plunged both into the waters.
I always wondered what became of the unfortunate little waif.
Jewels and treasures scattered along the shore. He had solved his financial problem, but would cause another. The phrase, "the straw that broke the camel's back," comes to mind. It wasn't just the waif's sudden disappearance that turned the town against him. It was just the spark that ignited the fire. The prophet had been raving for years about how dangerous the Ancestor was. No one believed it initially, but as time went by, the Ancestor proved him right.
The wild whispers of heresy roused the rabble to violent action. Such was the general air of rebellion that even my generous offer of gold to the local constabulary was rebuffed. To reassert my rule, I sought out unscrupulous men skilled in the application of force.
If the constables refused to protect him, he'd just hire his own. He hired the mercenaries, who we know as the brigands, to come and enforce his will in the town. Brigand Wolf came to the hamlet, along with his cannons, and they massacred the hamlet, culling the population to more manageable numbers.
Flames on the horizon. Sulfur in the air. The wolves are at the door.
They stayed around the estate, acting in the name of the Ancestor, as long as he paid. The mariners again raised the price of their services and secrecy. This seems a bit weird, since the Ancestor now controlled the town and the surrounding areas, but consider this. The mariners could tell the church, who would march their crusaders into the estate and have him executed. Or they could tell the neighboring kingdoms, who would do the exact same thing. Not only was the Ancestor studying topics the church would burn him alive for, but he had also killed innocents in the town. Unfortunately, his wealth was once again gone. The treasures he had acquired from the pelagic creatures were being spent on the brigands and the excavation. The mariners put him on the spot. He had to come up with a quick solution. So he gave them the run of the tavern, letting them drink and gamble and enjoy companionship for the night. But that was only a diversion.
While the greedy dogs slept off their revelry, I hexed their anchor with every twisted incantation I could muster, imbuing it with the weight of my ambition and my contempt for their crude extortion. At the witching hour, the anchor pulled with preternatural force, dragging craft and crew down into the depths. They must have cried out, but no sound escaped the swirling black waters.
This gives us the proof that these events occurred later. His skills have improved from when he was young. He could not have performed this feat, or the next one, in his early years. The reasons for why he resurrected the necromancers is unclear, but I speculate that it was to form an army of his own, one that isn't motivated by greed and loyal to him. He brought them back with their intelligence intact, which was a difficult feat to pull off for even the most experienced necromancer. He brought them back and commanded them to revive the dead soldiers in his ancestral castle. Now with an army of his own, should the brigands betray him, or another threat attack, he could fight back. So finally, after all this time, he achieved the impossible. The excavation was complete. He reached the door to the darkest dungeon. He opened it and began to explore with a team, and deep underground, they found the heart of the world. And this is when things get weird.
Finally, resigned to his uncommon corporeal resilience, I lured him to the dig. There, I showed him the thing and detailed the full extent of my plans. Triumphantly, I watched as he tore his eyes from their sockets and ran shrieking into the shadows, wailing maniacally that the end was upon us all.
we can assume that the ravings of the prophet unrested the heart, which caused its various protectors to attack the Ancestor and his team. The Ancestor fled the dungeon, laughing and screaming until he fell unconscious. Since he fell unconscious, and was the only survivor of the attack, the aftermath of this gets complicated, especially when we compare it to the opening cinematic. We see him writing the letter with the manor in the background, meaning he was probably in the ruins. He writes the letter, and when he completes it, he shoots himself. But some of the dialogue implies something slightly different happened too. That an angry mob was storming the manor, coming to take his life, but the letter was already sent.
I can still see their angry faces as they stormed the manor. But I was dead before they found me. And the letter was on its way.
It's hard to say what is true, hence why he's an unreliable narrator. The best compromise I can figure is this. As he was writing the letter, he watched the angry mob approach the manor from his study in the ruins. They would eventually find him, just not in the manor. He finished the letter and hands it to the caretaker to handle, then kills himself. Now, let's say that's true. The why is unclear. Could it have been out of guilt? I doubt it. He's not the kind of person to feel those emotions. The only regret he has is that he didn't live long enough to see the comet destroy the miller's mill.
The poor miller. Thrice a victim. The seasons took his livelihood. I took his land. And now, uncountable years later, the comet has taken his humanity. My only regret is that I did not live to see that shoddy mill smashed to pieces by the miraculous bounty I reaped from beyond the void.
In case you still had any doubts about his morality. Fear for his life? Well, if he was in the ruins, he had his own undead army of soldiers. Plus, as he put it to the prophet, he still had plans. Which is why I believe it is something else. A ritual, binding himself to the heart, to act as its avatar. Recall his speech to us at the last dungeon. He tells us this himself. He even tells us why he sent the letter.
Life feeds on life. In your petty pursuit of family redemption, you consume those who rally to your cause, and in so doing, you strengthen the thing, accelerating the end. This is as it should be. It is why you are here. In all my terrible researches, what I sought was a glimpse behind the veil, a crumb of cosmic truth. I found it here, and in that moment of brain-blasting realization, I ceased to be a man, and became a herald, an avatar of the crawling chaos. We are chained here forever, you and I, at the end of the world. Free yourself, rouse the thing, and embrace the ineffable cosmic hideousness that lives within us all.
He sent the letter to lure us and the heroes we recruit, to give the heart the nourishment it needs to reawaken. In hindsight, some of his quotes encouraging us to keep going take on a whole new meaning, when you consider that he's acting as a herald for the heart.
Trouble yourself not with the cost of this crusade. Its noble end affords you broad tolerance in your choice of means.
Is he genuinely encouraging us? Or is he just telling us what we want to hear, so we'll keep playing into his hands? All this time, and he's still controlling the estate. Alright, now let's have a talk about the channel, and where we go from here. I have 4 avenues I want to go down in terms of videos. The first is something I know a lot of people enjoy, which is the hero lore. But since we've covered all the base game heroes, we must turn our attention to the mod universe. Yes, more mod hero lore. The second is I want to talk more in depth about the areas we explore, the enemies we encounter inside of those areas, the hierarchy of certain factions, stuff like that. The third is more meta and theory related, like figuring out where the estate is and where certain heroes originate from. The fourth is something I'm still debating about, which I'd be interested to hear in what people think about it. While Darkest Dungeon will be the main source of this channel, I often wonder about expanding into other games, similar to Darkest Dungeon in terms of atmosphere, but within their own universe. And one game that I'd be willing to bet a lot of people who play Darkest Dungeon also enjoy. However things shake out, just know that I'm thankful for everyone watching my content. So as always, thank you for watching, and stay tuned.